Professor Utsa Patnaik, members and friends of the Sahmat organization, young ladies and gentlemen, and all other friends. I am very happy and feel privileged, in fact, that I should have been invited to speak on so important an event as the CHAMPARAN Satyagraha of 1917, whose centenary we are now celebrating, hopefully not only in Bihar but in different parts of India. CHAMPARAN Satyagraha, the first act in which the stream of peasant unrest joined the stream of the national movement, is of extraordinary importance. For these reasons, which I shall now try to go into some detail, celebrating Champaran is very important for us, not only as a remembrance, but also as a means of guidance for work in our own causes. As Professor Bipin Chandra has pointed out, the Indian national movement was indeed unique in that its ideology began not out of any religious sentiment, not out of any simple patriotic movement of native versus foreigner, but it began with an understanding of how Britain was exploiting India and a rejection of British policies, if not British rule in the beginning, for that reason. Long before the Champaran Satyagraha, Dadabhai Nauroji from around 1871 had been speaking of how Britain was exploiting India. The drain, the tribute, the burden of taxation, the impoverishment. All this was embodied in the collection of his articles, which were published in 1901, but had been in circulation in India earlier, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Almost simultaneously, Ramesh Chandra Dutt was writing the economic history of British India, in which he showed how Britain step by step was exploiting the Indian people and impoverishing India. Today, we can sustain their arguments, reinforce their arguments, go into further detail by immense use of statistics. The Indian national movement arose out of a grievance, not of middle classes, but of the Indian poor. Very little Dadabhai Nauroji or R.C. Dutt had to say about the Indian middle class. They belonged to it, their readers belonged to the Indian middle class, but they spoke of the Indian poor. And that's a remarkable feature of the early nationalist thought in India, whether you take Justice Ranade or J.V. Joshi or Dioskar and the other writers who wrote on Indian economy from the nationalist point of view. Dutt's own volumes were published in 1901 and 1993 as 2 volumes. They still remain classics. These views were translated into various languages. Barkatullah Khan, for instance, translated or wrote in, summed up in Urdu, the whole theory, whole presentation of the tribute and impoverishment of India based on the writings of Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Dutt. Gandhiji himself, in Hind Swaraj in 1909, written in Gujarati, summarized their conclusions. But although the Indian National Congress, the nationalists raised the question of impoverishment and British tribute, they had no links with the poor. Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Dutt could not organize the poor. Indian nationalists who were middle class men could not organize the poor. They were not linked with the very masses whose cause they were representing. In other words, they were lawyers without any connection, living connection with their clients. Champaran changed that. For the first time, the poor had their detailed grievances cared for by the nationalist leadership or by the potential nationalist leadership. And the man who did it, of course, was Mahatma Gandhi. Now, when you come to Mahatma Gandhi, one should remember that from 1890s to 1914, he was in, except for some short periods, he was in South Africa, working for the rights, fighting for the rights, and working for the welfare of Indians in South Africa. I know it is now fashionable to run down Gandhiji's years in South Africa as years of a racialist who tried to build Indian communities' position apart from that of the black Africans. Those who criticize, those who take this position, like Arundhati Roy and others, are welcome to that position. The reality is, however, different. The reality is that in India itself, that kind of agitation which Gandhi organized and led in South Africa had never taken place here. There had been no march of 2,000 miners with their families as took place in Transvaal in 1913. Nowhere in India. Nowhere in India were identity cards burnt. Nowhere in India had women gone to prison in such large numbers that Smuts had to release them because there was no provision in his jails for so many women. These were things unheard of in India. Now, clearly, this is what should strike us today. Not the limitedness of Gandhiji's causes, but the actual struggle, the actual forms of struggle, unheard of in India, unheard of in his own motherland. And therefore, when he came to India in 1915, he went from South Africa to England and then he came here. Gandhiji was already a mature man. He was already 44. And he spent the next 3 years, as we all know, in traveling around India, next 2 or 3 years. He attended the Indian National Congress sessions. He paid homage to the goal of home rule, Swaraj or Khud Mukhtari. But it was something else that he was interested in. Organizing for the first time the poor. And it is here that Champaran becomes very important. It's his first step in a whole history of struggles which was finally to obtain freedom for India. A small beginning apparently, but a crucial one. Gandhiji, because of his struggles in South Africa, was a well-known figure in India by 1970, at least among those who were educated in the middle class, who read about his agitation, Satyagrahas, bouts of passive resistance in South Africa. But he was unknown to the Indian poor. In fact, the nationalists were unknown to the Indian poor. They couldn't tender, as R.P. Dutt said, the huts of the poor whose cause they represented on paper. It was Gandhi who entered that hut. Now, the importance of the grievances against the European planters in the first place was that whereas the country was exploited by Britain through taxation, through tribute, through free trade, through deindustrialization, these things did not pit English directly against the exploited. The land tax was taken through the zamindars, the natives. The indirect taxes were collected by Indian native tax collectors. The British cloth, which drove Indian spinners and weavers out of employment, were sold by local Indian shopkeepers. Where was the Englishman in all this? It was only in the plantations, whether they were tea plantations in Assam or indigo plantations in Assam, in Bengal and Bihar, that individual Englishmen faced the exploited Indians. And this is one important part in the Champaran Satyagraha. The exploiters were not zamindars, Indian zamindars, the exploiters were British planters. To single them out was one important and brilliant act of Gandhi. Begin your satyagraha, begin your agitation from this particular point where the Indian peasant faced the European oppressor. Whether you spoke of home rule or not, whether you spoke of the national movement or not, it was bound to become a part of the national struggle. So let's come and see. I would not go so far. Indigo plantations were the earliest European plantations in India. They had the longest history. The boilers for processing indigo had been, that method had been discovered in the West Indies and employed there with slave labor. Now these boiler factories were established in Bengal by European indigo planters, and they then bought zamindaris or took long leases from zamindars so that they got control over the peasants of those zamindaris, and then forced them to grow indigo and sell that indigo at the prices they fixed, so that from the very beginning the exploitation, the degree of exploitation was severe, much more severe than by the zamindars, which is saying a lot. And so you have Bandhu Mitra's famous Neel Darpan in 1860, the famous play in which the oppression of the planters was portrayed, and almost simultaneously the so-called indigo disturbances in Bengal. But apart from those disturbances, the remarkable thing is the quiet with which the peasants suffered that oppression. The indigo planters spread into Bihar, into areas where indigo could be produced well. They purchased zamindaris, or as in Champaran, took long leases, thekas from the Betia zamindari and other zamindaris in the area, and then imposed a large number of oppressive practices on the indigo plant, on the peasants. These were numerous, forcing the peasants who became their tenants to grow indigo on the best part of their lands And then buy that indigo not by the actual weight of the crop, but by the area with the crop occupied, which always resulted in very low prices paid to the peasants. They also took begar, they also imposed illegal cesses, they also claimed a large number of things like even claiming the bodies, corpses of animals, cattle and so on, so that they could get the skins of the animals which had some prices, so that all kinds of malpractices were posed by the zamindars, by the planters. In 1880s, a synthetic dye was discovered in Germany, and that, as a result of it, indigo prices crashed. The indigo planters transferred the entire cost, the entire loss owing to the indigo new synthetic dye onto the shoulders of the peasants. If now indigo became so cheap that it was not worth the peasants to grow it, since the planters themselves were not purchasing it, the planters still took a large amount of money called tavan for allowing the peasants to shift to other crops. And they raised the rents on the agricultural lands. They made many other impositions where they were entitled to on paper through thekedari or through long leases from the zamindars by increasing rent and imposing other cesses and taxes. So the attempt was to throw the entire cost of the loss of indigo trade onto the shoulders of the peasants. Yet such was their influence, such was the oppression, such was the control they imposed on peasants through their agents and so-called chaprasis and others, that the peasants did not protest. They could complain, but to whom? In 1914, when the World War I broke out, suddenly indigo prices rose because the competition of the synthetic dye was no longer there. But if the loss of the competition from synthetic dye was put on the shoulders of the peasants, now that indigo became important, the entire profits were sought to be monopolized by the planters by increasing their oppressive practice, by intensifying their oppressive practices against the peasants. The tawa or compensation for choosing the crop that the peasants wanted to cultivate was increased. The abwab or illegal cesses were increased. In the thekedari villages, the long lease villages, the rents were increased. The prices paid for indigo were made lower and lower because of counting on the basis not of the actual produce but by the area in which the crop was grown. The ordinary produce rate, the average was from the produce rate taken in purchase was very low compared to the actual amount of the indigo that was produced from these areas. This was the common practice. So, instead of the peasants benefiting from the closing of the trade with Germany and the competition of the synthetic dye, in fact the peasants were put in a more and more an enviable position. the oppressions increased. And it was in this situation where the planters had everything, where they had full sway, where they could destroy anyone's house, where they could do almost anything they wanted in the district of Champaran and other adjoining areas. It was in this situation that the famous session of the Indian National Congress was held at Lucknow in December 1916, where the Congress and the League entered into a pact whereby the Muslim League accepted the objective of home rule and the Congress accepted the principle of communal electorates. Gandhiji was also there. Some people came from Champaran and told the delegates of the Congress whom they could meet, including Gandhiji, of the grievances they suffered. Gandhiji refused to move any resolution until he had seen the things for himself. That after he had gone to Calcutta, he was taken by one of the peasants who was oppressed and whose house in fact had been destroyed by planters, as Gandhiji found later, that Rajkumar Shukla, that Gandhiji was brought to Patna. He agreed to visit Champaran and see for himself. What happened in Patna, how Rajkumar Shukla suddenly disappeared for some reason, how Gandhiji had a hard time in the place he was set up, which was put up where, which was Dr. Rajendra Prasad's house, who was away, unfortunately, at the time, are all parts of traditional law. Gandhiji himself mentions that, but we are not concerned here with that. What is important is that Gandhiji persevered, and that's the important thing. Left alone, he still persevered. Goes to Muzaffarpur, meets people there, and then proceeds to Champaran district. Motihari is capital, ultimately. And what does he do? He says that I have come for an inquiry. There was Champaran Satyagraha is a misnomer. It was in fact much more than a Satyagraha. But what Gandhiji described was an inquiry. He had just come to find out for himself. And he gathered a band of followers, of whom Dr. Rajendra Prasad and Acharya Kripalani were well known, and some vakils, and they began recording peasants' complaints. When one peasant seems too ordinary, what is the use? But when one peasant had come to record complaints, 10 followed. For the first time, the planters saw defiance. That had never happened before. And therefore, the British government also woke up. Of course, they knew Gandhi's eminence for his work in South Africa. And what then happened, certainly team a lesson for us what a political leadership should do.